Right. In this video, we're going to talk about advantages and disadvantages of privatization. The first thing we must understand is that this is essentially something that happens in a mixed economy, right? Remember that in a mixed economy, there are two sectors. There is a private sector in which all assets are companies. For example, if we focus on companies, are owned and controlled by private individuals, firms, or organizations. And there is a public sector, which includes all the assets, and we can focus on companies that are owned and controlled by the government. Okay? In a mixed economy, these two sectors coexist. Privatization is basically, I'll give a more formal definition in a minute, but that's basically when something that used to belong to the public sector is sold to the private sector, it's transferred to the private sector. Okay, that's privatization. The opposite, you can mention it, why not? The opposite, when something goes from the private sector to the public sector, it's called nationalization. Okay, so from the public sector to the private sector, privatization. From the private sector to the public sector, that is nationalization. And usually privatization is something that occurs in a type of economy that we call a transition economy. A transition economy is one that is moving closer to a free market economy. It remains a mixed economy, of course, but the amount or the extent of government intervention gradually decreases. And one way in which the government can reduce its intervention, basically in a transition economy, the public sector is getting smaller and smaller, and the private sector is expanding. So one way in which an economy can transition towards or get closer to a free market economy is to use privatization, to transfer public assets into the private sector. And usually what happens is that the public companies are being sold to private organizations. So if you need to give a precise definition, how can we phrase it? Privatization. It's a transfer of ownership, transfer of ownership and control of an asset. Let's transfer ownership and control of an asset from the public sector to the private sector. So I wrote assets, but it's okay if you write firm, okay? Because whenever we talk about privatization, we are mostly talking about businesses that used to be run by the government and then are now run by the private sector. Okay, once you are finished with this introduction, you should start discussing the pros and cons. Let's start with the pros. Well, the main one is that it is expected there will be greater degree or greater competition. Because usually when you have a public firm, when you privatize, you basically open a market to competition. Because before, when the company was controlled by the government, in most cases, not always, but in most cases, this public company is the only one that supplies a particular market. So it's a public monopoly. So there is no competition, there is not much choice for consumers. Prices are not necessarily, but can be high because cost of production can be high. There is likely to be little innovation. So well, that may not be amazing for consumers. Privatization, on the other hand, when this company is transferred from private sector from the public sector to the private sector, what usually happens is that now the market is open for new firms to enter, to compete, and this is something that can ultimately benefit consumers, in the sense that we will have lower prices because the competition will encourage firms to offer the lowest possible price. Would be better quality because, again, now that firms compete with each other, it's important that they provide the good of the highest possible quality to gain or to defend their market shares, because they want to. Each firm is likely to sell a product that is going to be slightly different from their competitors. It is also something that will benefit consumers because they will have more choice. There will be a greater product diversity. And again, in firms, in order to compete with their rivals, they may innovate, try to improve the features of their products, to be innovative, and this is something that can ultimately benefit the consumers. So that's clearly the main advantage of privatization. I forgot to mention greater efficiency in the production process, because of course, when we compete, it is important to keep our costs as low as possible. And that's why firms will make sure that their production process is as efficient as possible. So they won't waste resources. So in terms of resource allocation, it's likely to be quite efficient. One pro from the perspective of the government is that if the government sells the company to the private sector, it could be a one-time source of income from the government, for all revenue. The government is going to get money by selling this company to the private sector. Is there anything else? So these are clearly the main advantages. Okay, I'll try to find a third one. In the meantime, I'll start with the cons. Well, the main problem that we may face is market failures. Because in the public sector, the government was the one making decisions. So the government could take decisions in the interest of the entire society. So, for example, taking into consideration all costs, not only private costs and private benefit, but social costs and social benefit, to reduce externalities, for example. But once the company belongs to the private sector, and once this product is supplied by private firms, they will be driven by the profit incentive, and market failures are likely to arise. So that's, of course, one problem we may have. Another risk would be unemployment. It's not necessarily the case, but remember that firms, when they compete with each other, it's important that they keep their costs to the lowest possible level, and this might lead to some certain jobs being destroyed. Okay, as firms want to keep their costs to the lowest possible level, they will only keep the minimum number of workers that is necessary to sustain production. So overall, this is likely to lead to some jobs being destroyed. Something that can also be an issue is the problem of economies of scale, and that's an important one. Economies of scale. Here, I'll graph it because this one is quite important. Remember, the concept of economy of scale is the idea that in certain industries, the more we produce, the lower our average cost of production, or our per unit cost of production. And so when we had this big public company that was supplying the entire market, it was producing for everyone. We had a single company producing a very large level of output. And so at the end of the day, the cost of production, the per unit cost of production, was very low, because this public monopoly, this public firm, was enjoying very substantial economies of scale. But once we privatize this industry, this company, when the market is going to be supplied by private firms, it's likely that there will be many smaller firms, smaller private firms, each of them producing a low level of output. And in this case, because they each produce a lower, small level of output, they do not benefit from substantial economies of scale, and so they will produce at a relatively high cost, meaning that this relatively high cost can translate into high price. I'll just write that at the, I'll just, once I have erased everything, I will graph it. I forgot to mention something about market failures. I talked about externalities, but there is also the risk, and that's really something that you should mention. That we said that, well, one advantage is greater competition. Well, that's what we can hope. This is what we can expect. But it's very possible that once the industry is being privatized, it's possible that one firm is going to take the control of the market. So in that case, privatizations is likely to be not beneficial, because it would simply lead to the replacement of a public monopoly by a private monopoly. And when a public monopoly is likely to act on behalf of the interest of society, perhaps by charging relatively low price, well, now you have a private monopoly that is driven by the profit incentive, that wants to maximize profit, and that might lead to much higher prices than before. So that's clearly something that should be taken into consideration. Let me just review my notes so I can find something else to add for pros. So yeah, I don't think I forgot anything. So in terms of the advantages, yeah, we have greater, that's everything is linked to the fact that we have more competition for greater efficiency in production, because of course we need to keep our costs as low as possible. And also because resources will now be allocated by supply and demand, which means that firms will have an incentive to produce the goods and services that are the most valued by consumers. Lower prices because there is competition, more product diversity, because like I said, each firm will have an incentive to differentiate itself from the competition, and so consumers will have a choice. Better quality, I talked about that. One-time source of income for the government as they sell the public assets to the private sector. So in fact, that's it. These are basically the pros. Main disadvantages, I wrote reduced ability to take advantage of the economies of scale. We talked about that. Market failure, and in particular the fact that a public monopoly can simply be replaced by a private monopoly. And employment. Okay, so I didn't forget anything. Let me just finish by graphing, because yeah, you see for this particular topic, there are not much diagrams that you can use. And I told you that you should really use at least one diagram for each presentation. So for this particular topic, I feel like the best diagram that you can make is the following one. And that's the cost. So what we're going to do is that we're going to show the long run average total cost, which is basically the per unit cost. Long run, why long run? Because the concept of economy of scale is a long run concept. So imagine, initially we had one public firm producing for everyone, producing 100 units, and because it produces a large level of output, it has a very low cost of production, say $10. And because we benefit from those economies of scale, we can produce at a lower cost, and therefore we may be able to sell at a lower price. Good news for consumers. Now, if we privatize the industry, and that if we now have, let's say, 10 firms in this market, each of them selling 10 units, we have 10 firms, each of them producing 10 units, but each of them produces at a cost of $20. So overall, the output is the same, but you see that now each private firm produces at a much higher cost than the former public monopoly, which may translate into higher prices for consumers. For example, the government initially, when this was a public firm, to produce 100 units, $10 each, so the total cost was $1,000. And now the total cost is, if you have 10 firms, each producing 10 units, each firm produces 10 at a cost of 20. So each firm has a total cost of $200, and there are 10 firms, so we have a total cost of $2,000. So you see that it's much more costly to produce in this case. So again, in terms of the efficiency of the productive efficiency, the allocation of resources, you see that whenever you have an industry in which there are substantial economies of scale, it makes more sense to have a single firm producing for everyone, and preferably a public firm, a public monopoly, to ensure that this public monopoly is not going to take advantage of its market power by charging very high prices. So it's better to have a public monopoly that produces for everyone and that can keep prices relatively low. So that's about it. Yes, I think we mentioned everything, and that's a cool diagram that you can use to illustrate the fact that privatization can prevent or reduce the ability of private firms to take advantage of economies of scale. That's about it.